The legend of the old St. Jude's Library didn't start with a ghost. It started with the dust. It was a rhythmic, suffocating pulse of settling debris and shifting shadows that seemed to tighten around the throat of anyone foolish enough to stay past the turning of the tide. That invisible moment when evening ceases to be late and begins to be wrong. The weight of the stacks. A year ago, I was a student drowning in the frantic saltwater pressure of final exams. The administration, in a rare fit of bureaucratic empathy, had granted us a temporary reprieve from the usual 5 o'clock lockup. They kept the hum of the overhead fluorescents buzzing until 11 to accommodate our collective desperation. Living only 3 blocks away in a cramped, radiator-clanking apartment, I found the oppressive, ink-stained atmosphere of the stacks more conducive to focus than the distractions of my bedroom. But that night, the night the air changed, the atmosphere felt chemically altered. It was charged with a localized static that made the fine hairs on my forearms stand at attention like soldiers awaiting a command. By 10 o'clock, the bustling sanctuary of scholars had withered into a tomb. The comforting scratching of pens, the soft sighs of overworked freshmen, and the rhythmic rustle of turning pages had been replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I was deep in the bowels of the history section, a place where the air smelled of vanillin and decay. My desk was illuminated by a single flickering lamp that cast long skeletal fingers across the spines of forgotten biographies. I realized with a sudden jolt of adrenaline that I was utterly alone. The building felt hollow, as if the very soul of the school had evaporated, leaving behind only the cold stone and the memory of footsteps. I told myself I only needed 15 more minutes to finish my notes on the Industrial Revolution. I just needed to bridge the gap between then and now. But the focus I had cultivated all evening shattered when a sound drifted from the corridor, a sound that didn't belong in a house of learning. The sound in the hall. It wasn't a footstep, not really. It was a dragging, wet thud, a rhythmic, agonizing cycle. Step, slide, step, slide. It suggested something heavy, something uncoordinated, hauling itself across the linoleum with the persistence of a predator that has all the time in the world. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. The instinct to flee, the ancient lizard brain run command, overrode every academic ambition I had left. I gathered my belongings with trembling hands. The zipper of my backpack sounded like a chainsaw in the dead air, a violent intrusion into a silence that didn't want to be broken. I bolted toward the exit, my sneakers squeaking with agonizing loudness on the polished floors. The corridor outside the library was a cavernous stretch of architectural gloom. As I rounded the corner toward the main entrance, my breath hitched. Framed by the moonlight spilling through the glass transoms, stood a silhouette. It was a woman. She was draped in rags that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. She stood perfectly still, but her head was cocked at an unnatural 90-degree angle, resting nearly on her shoulder. The discomfort I felt wasn't merely fear, it was a soul-deep revulsion. My body knew, even if my mind refused to admit it, that I was looking at something that defied the laws of biology. "Who is there?" I cried out, my voice cracked, echoing uselessly off the metal lockers. She didn't answer with words. She simply melted into the darkness of a side stairwell. Her movement wasn't human, it was fluid and wrong, like ink dispersing in a glass of water. The vacuum of the street. I didn't wait to see if she would return. I burst through the heavy front doors into the night air, expecting the cold wind to ground me. But the street outside was even more terrifying in its emptiness. The street lamps flickered with an orange dying glow, casting strobe-like pulses over the pavement. The usual sounds of the city, the distant hum of tires on the expressway or the barking of a neighborhood dog, had been replaced by a vacuum of sound. I walked with my chin tucked into my chest, staring at the concrete, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks brought on by exhaustion and a toxic intake of caffeine. It was just a squatter, I told myself, just a trick of the shadows. But then, a second shadow appeared. It didn't come from a lamp. It stretched out from behind my own feet, lengthening and widening until it overtook mine. There was someone directly behind me. I could feel the displacement of air, a pocket of cold that followed in my wake. I spun around, my lungs burning. I saw her again. She was hobbling toward me, her limbs twisted into grotesque, jagged shapes, as if every bone in her frame had been broken and reset by a blind surgeon. Her clothes were caked in the gray grime of the earth, not dirt, but grave soil. Her hair was a matted, tangled veil that hid her face, yet I could feel the heat of a gaze piercing through the knots. She moved with a limping, agonizing persistence. Her body jerked with every step, as if she were a marionette controlled by a trembling, uncertain hand. I was paralyzed. My legs had turned to lead, rooted to the cracked sidewalk as she drew closer. The smell hit me first, stagnant water and old, rotting lilies. She stopped just inches from me. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. In a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping over a gravestone, she whispered a question that chilled my marrow. "Have you seen my daughter?" The revelation of Agatha. I couldn't find my voice. I could only point a shaking, terrified finger toward the dark, yawning mouth of a distant alleyway, desperate for her to turn her gaze away. She obeyed, dragging her broken frame into the shadows. As her form was swallowed by the blackness, a scream erupted, a high-pitched, jagged lament that tore through the night and seemed to shatter the very windows of the surrounding houses. The world tilted. The stars above spun into chaotic streaks of light, and the darkness finally claimed me. I woke up hours later in my own bed, my skin clammy and my mind fractured. I had been found face down on the asphalt by a neighbor who thought I had fainted from the summer heat. It was only weeks later, through whispered conversations with the local elders at the corner diner, that the pieces fell into place. They told me of Agatha. In 1998, Agatha lived in the shadow of the school. Her entire existence was tethered to her 9-year-old daughter, Lily. One afternoon, during a routine recess, a freak accident involving a collapsing equipment shed had crushed the life out of the girl in an instant. Agatha hadn't just lost a child, she had lost her mind. She spent her remaining days wandering the school perimeter, her body withering away from grief until she eventually collapsed and died on the very spot where I had encountered her. Now she is a permanent fixture of the night, a grieving phantom trapped in a loop of eternal loss. She is forced to roam the corridors and the cold pavement, forever searching for a little girl who rests in a grave she can never reach. And woe betide any student who lingers long enough to hear the dragging of her feet and the hollow, heartbreaking sound of her question.